Honest J. Nowak. Coming at you live. Alright. A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to HJN Graphix. And today we're going to be trying our hand at something different here for today's pick that I have arranged. For episode number 816, we're going to be going ahead and going with Supermassive Games' own horror entry, Until Dawn. Released in November 2015. It was quite an exhilarating experience the first time around. Me, Luke, several others were all gathered up together on a large sofa, all wrapped up in blankets, with all the lights turned off and the windows closed. Nothing but the glow of the television in front of us. That 74-inch Mitsubishi flat screen was showing unbelievable amounts of horror. For a more recent title at the time, I will say that for something that's already going to be 6 years old, man, Supermassive Games must have been pretty busy with it, because I will say for sure that for something like this, they've really pulled off a nice job on the horror, on the storyline, on the character development, on a lot of things around all of this. It was also one of the few games on the PS4 that I really got to know about how graphically they were able to utilize motion capture as a way to pretty much claim the actors as realism, to make it feel more real. You have 8 different characters that you play in this game. Ashley, Sam, Josh, Emily, Matt, Chris, Mike, Jessica. Oh wow, man. I tell you, this was quite an enjoyable title. And the fact that I even went ahead and, well, revisited it last August, alongside several other titles as well. So the thing is, August 2020 was a huge time for gaming. August 2021, of course, was a huge time based on picking up money left and right. I had so many jobs around that time period. I tell you, every August of every year seems to be something bigger and something brighter. Maybe August of 2022 will be something even better. But you know what? Until Dawn, at least something in 2015, it probably was not necessarily the greatest we could have ever gotten in horror games. I'd say they pulled off a nice job here, because it was new at the time. And because it's going to be 6 years old, I myself still feel relatively the same as I did on day one. And 2015, of course, was a huge year in my lifetime, being the peak of autism spectrum. At the same time, there was also foreign accent syndrome underlying my own vocal cords, which was a huge embarrassment and a huge disruption to my personal life. I really could not bear that sort of thing any longer, so I was glad to have a lot of help psychologically and vocally, because I was able to get rehabilitated within the span of almost a year. So to this day, this is the real voice that you're hearing here. The way that I see Until Dawn, though, nowadays, because I especially went ahead and revisited it, so details are still fresh in my mind, pretty much, even though it's been over a year, is that the fact that this actually does have quite a big premise to it. You have 8 different friends who regularly meet up with each other inside of a large household settled on a mountaintop deep inside the winter every single year. But this one point in time is where the horror really starts to take place, because a year prior to the events that the game is premising is that there were basically a few deaths that had taken place. Josh, who was the owner of the house and who also had a few siblings, encouraged, well, some pretty bad behavior and a lot of bad blood taking place. Eventually Josh went too far on a simple prank and ended up forcing both of the poor siblings to leave the house. One ran out and the other went over to go after the other one. So the thing is that, well, eventually they both end up getting into quite a struggle. It got to a point where they end up encountering death itself rather quickly. But then, of course, we gotta remember that the following year would be a time where both of these deaths would be fairly remembered very well. Because when the eight return to the same house where Josh was waiting for them, then, well, you really got to admit that there are certainly a bunch of other things to look out for. Because along the way, you'll also get to learn a bunch about some other things here. The main thing about this game, though, is its point-and-click sort of perspective. It's almost like with a bunch of other games, like the Telltale games, and even the more recent Quantic Dream games. Because you do have to do a lot of actions that encourage a lot of different actions with the controller or with the different buttons that are used. You gotta repeatedly tap on the buttons or click at them at the right time, otherwise a video will load showing that you failed a certain action. And when you fail too many actions, then it probably just seems that there could be a time where you might actually put one of the 8 characters at death's door, pretty much. Now, I was able to play this game twice, because this is one of those that does have some replay value put into it. And the most replay value that you could probably get is, well, how many characters are you going to allow to survive? Or how many of them are you going to allow to die? Well, simply put, the first playthrough I pretty much went during my revisitation last year on Until Dawn in particular, was that the first playthrough I went through, I basically only allowed like 4 people to pretty much stay alive. But then, of course, well, the unfortunate thing is, well, I was able to allow for even more people to survive on the second playthrough. I specifically remember on the first playthrough that most of the characters, including Josh, Jessica, and Chris, they all unfortunately end up getting killed. And the second playthrough, I ended up allowing Sam, Josh, and Jessica again to pretty much die off. And same thing with Mike, who ends up, well, you know, doing anybody in who was still inside the house. But here's the main premise about this game itself. The mountainside itself is cursed. A legend known as the Wendigo have inhabited the mountainside for a long time. And according to some mysterious person out there with a large flamethrower, who was in fact an ex-con called Victor, apparently, to Victor's knowledge, the Wendigos are not necessarily the typical kind of monster that you would be able to find in some supernatural things and would be easily put down by a certain weakness. No, these Wendigos do not mess around. They tear anybody limb from limb, as I was able to see during both of my playthroughs of the game itself. And even more so, let's not forget that Josh is still the same old Rami Malek that we know and love. The same old Rami Malek who would eventually make an appearance in Doolittle 2020, and not to mention, well, various other media that would take place. Cameos and various, well, appearances and all that good stuff. So, meanwhile, we got the majority of the other casting members out there, including actor Peter Stormare, who was actually a psychologist who appears in cutscenes that happen in between certain parts of the game that take place. So, at the time I could not necessarily understand why, but eventually it comes down to the fact that Peter Stormare plays the psychologist who basically took care of Josh. Because especially after the deaths of both of Josh's siblings, pretty much, it came down to the fact that Josh was going to go mentally insane, and so Josh had to go seek help. And we see a lot develop from Josh entirely, and the psychologist, who apparently does appear even after all of those sessions. That would explain why we get to see this character a lot during the game. And Peter Stormare makes for a great person by any means, as a psychologist or otherwise. It doesn't matter what kind of acting job you basically do here, it's just that this is pretty much how good you can basically pull it off. But in the end, of course, the Wendigos all gather up inside the house, where Josh would supposedly be, but unfortunately for both playthroughs, I could not figure out how to get Josh out of there alive, so that's pretty much just what that is. And same thing with Jessica. But the main thing is that, well, if you do allow certain characters to survive, then you get yourself a little bonus. During the credits, there are clips of the different characters whom are being interviewed by the local police, wanting to know exactly what had happened in that area at the time. And then, of course, we gotta remember, the insane action, lure, and plenty of other unique things about this game just make it so enjoyable. I will say though, one flaw might be the frame rate in the game itself. Graphically, it probably doesn't matter much if the game plays well. But to me, the frame rate itself was a bit too slow. I mean, it was like, what, 8 frames per second? I mean, that was kind of a disappointment alone, but I guess I'll just take it as it is. So the bottom line here is that Until Dawn is an enjoyable game, and you can pick it up on a pretty low price on Amazon these days, or whatever kind of e-commerce platform you're willing to use, as a way to buy yourself a nice fresh copy. Of course, I probably won't revisit it again, on top of the fact that I do have plenty of other games I need to work with, but I will say it's still a great title, no matter what people might think about it. So much so that there actually was a sequel known as Until Dawn Rush of Blood, something like that, which unfortunately I could not play because it was a VR only title. But as far to my knowledge, it's one of those typical sort of modern day rail shooters that would appear in most arcade games these days. So I guess there's not much to point up about that. So that's pretty much it right here. This was a pretty long episode in and of itself, but you know what? That's kind of what happens here. The fact that I played Until Dawn the first time it came out, and then I played it again, and then again, last August. That was a pretty long run. But yet there are plenty of other titles that I will go ahead and talk about soon enough. So if you want to see more go down to my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.